Now, to do sleight of mouth, you need to know where you're leading a person. It's great to use the agreement frame. I agree with you and blah, blah, blah. But once you're pacing them so nicely, you need to know where you're going to lead them. You need to know what the belief is that you want them to begin to adopt, right? So as an example, if we look at those Robert Dilts examples, the one that says cancer causes death. Okay, fine. We know we don't want them to believe that. That would be bad, right? Not useful, not helpful. But what specifically do you want to lead them to? You could say to yourself, if you do exactly what the doctors tell you, you'll be okay. Maybe that'll be a choice you make. Or you'll say to yourself or say to them, well, that used to be true, but now most people live from today's modern therapies. So again, sort of the same thing, do what the doctors tell you. Or you could say, what I want them to believe is alternative therapies and positive mental attitude are what's going to help them and prevail here. So we want to lead them to that way of believing and doing things. Or you could say, okay, cancer causes death. No, it doesn't cause death. It just causes diminishment of quality of life. I mean, science these days can slow death inevitably. Not exactly my first choice, but it's a choice. And choices is what you have to make. You have to make a choice about where you're going to lead somebody in order to begin to formulate these sleight of mouth patterns. And by the way, this should also be said, this maybe should even be a whole other chapter, but let me just say now that sleight of mouth can be used in two ways. You can use sleight of mouth, as we've been talking about, to change a belief system from X to Y, or from a bad belief to a good belief, let's say it that way, even though it's a little simplistic, from this to that. You can also use sleight of mouth to reinforce a belief that's already there that's a good one, but perhaps hasn't been generalized well enough or far enough or whatever. I think about it in a sort of limited way. Just thinking off the top of my head, say somebody just learned how to ride a bike for the first time. They're 50 years old and they never learned how to ride a bike, and they've felt bad about themselves their whole life for this reason. So let's say they took lessons and learned how to ride a bike, and they learn. And now that they think to themselves, okay, I'm not so bad. I'm not such a inept bike riding failure anymore. I'm okay. I've learned. Yes, good for me. And you can say, well, yeah, that is good. And isn't it more important to focus on the successes than how long it took you? Because after all, you never had the opportunity to learn. Once you've taken the opportunity and focused on it, you learn very quickly. And as you do that more and more, you'll find that that's a pattern that you really are. You can redefine it. You can say it's not that you're just a okay bike riding expert now. You're a modeler, and you can model any behavior and learn that. So you can begin to generalize much more broadly than just that one definition that they'd given them. I hope that makes sense. So you can use the sleight of mouth patterns both to reinforce a belief that just needs to be made better, as well as changing it from A to B. Okay, so now we've got their belief. We know what it is. We have it in the formula that we want. We have it complex equivalence or cause and effect, right? The A equals B and the A means B. We have it. We're ready. We also know where we want to go. We know what belief they have and what belief we think would be better for them, where we want to take them. So now what? Right? Now what do we do with it? Well, now is the time to utilize those sleight of mouth patterns. So where do you start? By the way, as we proceed, you're going to notice that some of these patterns are familiar to you. And as I've said before, that's okay. The idea is that we're going to give them names, labels, and put them in a location so we can get hold of them, so we know exactly where they are. And all this preliminary work has been really crucial because it reminds me of the story about the guy that knew where to tap. You know that story? I'll tell you real quick. There's a story about an aircraft carrier, like a multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier that was built, and it just wasn't working right. So they hired this guy to come in, this expert to come in and do some troubleshooting. So this guy comes in. He's carrying a little black bag with him, and he walks around, and he's looking and listening and reading gauges and stopping and listening some more. And Finally, he walks down this corridor, puts down his little black bag, reaches in, pulls out this wrench, reaches up above him. There's this pipe and there's this valve, in this pipe. Reaches up with his wrench and taps it, maybe about 1/4 of an inch. All of a sudden, this billion-dollar aircraft carrier that's been going suddenly goes, it's just humming away perfectly. Everything in sync. Puts his wrench back in the bag, goes up to the admiral and says, okay, that'll be $10,000, please. And the admiral's like, excuse me? You've been here for what, an hour maybe? You tap on a valve and you're done? $10,000? I don't think so. I need an itemized bill, please. Guy goes, okay. So he reaches in his black bag, pulls out this little pad, writes on it, hands it to the admiral. Admiral looks at it and says, for tapping on the valve, $1. For knowing where to tap, $9,900. So it's knowing where to tap. All this preliminary work has been figuring out where to tap, where to, do the entry point for the belief, and where we can make the most elegant shifts in the belief in the consciousness. The rest of it is easy, especially if you know these patterns. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through these patterns one by one. We're going to look at the different mind maps, look at them in different ways so we can learn these patterns. So let's open the book to the first mind map. One of the classic Robert Dilts examples, saying mean things means you're a bad person. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start with one belief and one pattern. And we're going to go to another belief, the same pattern. We're going to use the same pattern in 4 different beliefs, 4 different contexts, so you can see how that pattern of responding works, no matter what the belief. So you're going to learn the pattern of responding. We're going to start with the hierarchy of criteria, only because you've got to start somewhere. It's not to say that there's a hierarchy of using these patterns. There isn't. It's what works best in the particular situation. But as with most mind maps, you start up in the upper right-hand corner and move around in a circular fashion. So that's what we're going to do, just because we do have to do something, and that is as good as anything else. So we're going to start with hierarchy of criteria. Look at the upper right-hand corner. You'll see it up there. It's drawn a shape kind of like the 10 Commandments tablets that Moses had, the tablet that those were written on. And those are, in a way, values. Those are saying, first, thou shalt not kill. Second, thou shalt not be a jerk. They've got different commandments. It's a hierarchy. So that's why it's drawn like this. These are a hierarchy of criteria, hierarchy of values that the person will respond to. Make sense? So let's take a look at the first one. That's hierarchy of criteria in the pattern, saying mean things means you're a bad person. So the hierarchy of criteria response to that would be, don't you think it's more important to be genuine or honest than to tell people only what they want to hear? Now, if you're reading along with me, you'll notice that I left some words out. There's a whole kind of shopping list of possible responses listed here. It's kind of a listing program written out. So if I'd read it the way that it's written, it sounds like it could be kind of overwhelming to a person, kind of an overload. But it could work as well, so you give them a whole bunch of things that they can pick from, and they'll pick the value that actually works for them. So think about how that works in that particular belief, and then now turn the page. Take a look at the next belief, cancer causes death. Take a look at the same pattern up in the upper right-hand corner, the same shape that's there. The hierarchy of criteria response to that belief could be, don't you think it's more important to focus on what would make life worth living and how to make it more worth living for everyone rather than to focus so much on one's own death? So you're beginning to see the pattern now. You're taking the importance of a particular criteria. Turn the page. Your being late means that you don't care about me. That's the belief. Going to the upper right-hand corner, there it is in those tablets. Isn't it more important to fulfill my responsibilities to the people who are depending on me than to be punctual? And now just turn the page one more time. We have one more example here. Nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. Well, don't you think it's unmanly or unfair or dishonorable to bully people by using excessive force when they are unarmed or unprepared? Now, I'd like you to notice something here. In all of these cases, the language has started with either, don't you think it's more important, or isn't it more important? So you're asking it as a question. You could also say it as a statement. Well, I think it's more important. But by asking it as a question, it's kind of softened up a little bit. It creates more of a discussion sort of sound. In any of these examples, the way you present yourself, the communication is only 7% of the actual words you choose. 38% is the tonality, and physiology is 55%, according to Noam Chomsky. So if you take a look at that, the tonality and the way you present yourself, you could have a very different effect. You could say something like, don't you think it's more important to be manly? Use that kind of tonality. It's not going to get you half the rapport, because I said, I think in an earlier chapter, you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. Well, you understand my meaning. The other thing that's important to notice about the hierarchy of criteria is that, like I said, in some cases you get the shopping list of things. You can use the shopping list of different values there and let them pick one. Perhaps you'll hit one that works for them out of 3 that don't. The other thing is, if you know their values, it can make it that much more powerful. As an example, look at the one that says nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. Now, if you were talking to a very scientific person, who had a very analytical mind, the argument that's presented here, unmanly, unfair, dishonorable, wouldn't mean a thing to him. Those aren't values. Well, I might, but chances are those aren't values that he really cares about. He's just thinking scientifically. But this argument, kind of interesting actual history here, this argument was put together by Robert Dilts for Timothy Leary when Timothy Leary was on a lecture circuit, if you can believe this or not, with G. Gordon Liddy. I don't know if you know who these two gentlemen were or are, but they're kind of like an odd couple, totally different people, both very intelligent, but from a very different spectrum of belief systems and values. And they were on this college lecture circuit back in the 70s at some point, and having these, formal lectures, formal debates about nuclear arms. G. Gordon Liddy, of course, one of the Watergate people, conspirators, very manly, ex-Marine, high value on manliness and honor. G. Gordon Liddy, the author of Tune In, Tune Out, Tune In, Turn On, and Drop Out. He promoted LSD back in the 60s. Anyway, very odd pairing of people, but both very intelligent. Timothy Leary, however, was losing. G. Gordon Liddy was kind of an interesting character, but not stupid at all. And he was winning these arguments every time. So Leary was smart enough to go to Robert Dilts. And he asked for help creating this mind map to be able to argue that, nuclear arms don't cause strength, protection, and safety. Argue the opposite of that. So one of the patterns that worked best for this argument was this hierarchy of criteria, because think about it. G. Gordon Liddy, an ex-Marine, high value on honor. And here you're saying to him, don't you think it's unmanly, unfair, dishonorable to bully people by using excessive force when they are unprepared or unarmed? So you're hitting G. Gordon right where he lives. So this was extremely useful for him. So if you know somebody's values, use them. If you don't know their values, you might have to give them this kind of shopping list and a kind of more of a scattershot approach to winning. But it's, again, going back to that thing about tapping on the valve. If you know and can tap in the right place, it makes it that much more powerful. Okay, so now let's go back to the first mind map, the one that says saying mean things means you're a bad person. And let's look at the next pattern, the consequence pattern. Consequence pattern you'll see in a circular motion down from a hierarchy of criteria, moving down clockwise, kind of at 3 o'clock. And speaking of time, it's drawn as an arrow going from left to right. This is to indicate a movement in time. So the consequence in time of having this belief, or a consequence of having not done the action, you'll see the differences in a few minutes. But it's the consequence. So let's take a look at the first one. Saying mean things means you're a bad person. I'm only saying these things to make them better. If I didn't say mean things, I'd do them. Or if there weren't bad people, then who would tell us our faults? So keep in mind, saying mean things means you're a bad person is being said to you by a person who's accusing you of saying mean things. You're using sleight of mouth to defend yourself. In the next example, a person says or believes, you've determined that they believe cancer causes death, this cause and effect belief. You want to lead them out of that, so you're saying Well, beliefs like this tend to become self-fulfilling prophecies because people stop exploring their choices and options. In the next example, you're being late means you don't care about me. Again, you're being verbally attacked, if you will, by someone. So you can use verbal aikido. You say, well, if I hadn't been late, I might have lost my job or contacts, but I cared too much about you to risk it. You could also say, having a belief like that probably does make caring or not caring just a matter of time. That's a really good one to demonstrate the pattern, not necessarily recommended in relationships. By the way, just let me say that that's true for all these patterns. This is to demonstrate how the patterns work. These aren't necessarily a guide to relationship endurance, longevity. So let's move on to the final example of these 4 classic DILTS examples. Nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. Believing that nukes are the only way to be safe can lead to weakness because we failed to see other possible choices. This belief leads to paranoia, which makes people act irrationally. So, this is the consequence pattern. And you can see how some of the patterns were about the consequence of holding the belief. Some of the patterns were about doing or not doing a particular behavior based on that belief. So either way, it is the consequence down the road of something having to do with that belief. So you help the person to change their belief by helping them see what consequences that belief would have or what consequences a behavior based on that belief would have. I'd like to just stop for a moment and interject a suggestion, a direction suggestion. I'd like to offer you the direction that a best way to learn these patterns is to write out your own. If I were teaching a class right now, I'd stop the class. We would all come up with a belief that we could collectively work on. Like if we were all NLP practitioners, we might come up with a belief like, NLP can't be any good because it happens so quickly. And we all know that change takes time. We'd come up with a belief like that. We'd get it into the if-then meaning structure. We'd decide which part of it we're going to create patterns on, and then we'd come up with our own patterns collectively. We'd brainstorm on it and come up with our own. When I first learned how to do the sleight of mouth patterns with Robert Dilts, I took the patterns home. I went to the Xerox store. I Xeroxed 20 of these blank mind maps. So the patterns, the shapes were all there, but they were blank. And I came up with my own patterns, one a day. I did one a day for 20 days. And I'll tell you, you just get it ingrained in your brain. Right now, I can just look up and see this in front of me. There's a plexiglass screen in front of me, like 3 feet wide, 2 feet high. And I can just reach up. In fact, do that. Just close your eyes for a minute. Imagine it right there in front of you. This page is now in front of you in a little whiteboard or a screen like that. Reach up with your left hand and your right hand just to touch that A equals B or A causes B thing in the center. Then reach up with your right hand up to the upper right hand corner and touch the hierarchy of criteria pattern. See it in your mind and touch it. Get this spatially anchored in your brain. And then down in a clockwise motion, the arrow going out to the right, the consequence pattern. That's all I've done so far, but I want you to do this for all these things. This is an interjection. I won't say this again. This is the only time this will appear again. I think I've said some of this before. But this is the only time I'm going to repeat it on the CD set. But do this with all the patterns so that when you get to the counterexample, when you get to the, changing frame size, etc., you'll do the same thing. You'll stop or you'll write your patterns. You'll have it in your mind. You'll get this anchored for yourself. So you'll use it when you need it. The tools will be available to you when you need it in real life. The other thing I just want to point out real quickly is that some of these patterns use what could be referred to as transformational vocabulary. In other words, you change some of the words in order to suggest other meanings as well. Like in the pattern, you're being late means you don't care about me. If you go up to the hierarchy of criteria pattern that we just learned a few minutes ago, you see, isn't it more important to focus on, getting my job done and effectively to help the people that are depending on me than to be punctual? So we've changed the lateness into punctuality. It sort of diminishes it just verbally. So it helps to bolster your side of the argument by diminishing that lateness thing. This happens in many of the different patterns. You'll see this throughout the patterns. Notice it and use it. Now, let's get back to the patterns. So let's go on to another outcome. It's a pattern going down in the lower right-hand corner. You'll notice, again, we're going clockwise around a circle around the mind map. Let's go back to the first mind map. Now, another outcome is like saying it's another story. It's another argument. We're not really talking about this or that. We're talking about something else entirely. It's like changing the subject. So let's take a look at saying mean things means you're a bad person. Well, the issue here is not whether I'm saying mean things or I'm a bad person, but rather what responses your communication elicits. Do the ends justify the meanness? Very cute little verbal thing there, isn't it? Go on to the next page. Cancer causes death. Another outcome. The real issue isn't what causes death, but rather what causes life and health. Let's focus on that. Next page, next argument, which is, your being late means you don't care about me. Another outcome. Well, whether I'm late or uncaring isn't the issue, but rather whether we can meet each other's needs in this relationship without laying any unnecessary trips on one another. And the last example, nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. You know, the real issue isn't whether nukes make us safe, but rather, number one, it's worth protecting. Number two, whether there's a better choice. Or number three, whether we're acting honorably and logically and not just out of fear. So, another outcome, a great, great, great pattern to learn, because here again, you're just changing the subject in a sense. And you're just kind of like sidestepping the whole thing. That's not the real issue. You might be right about that, but we're not talking about that. The real important thing is this issue. Let's focus on this issue. This is what's really important. Okay? Make sense? The next pattern we're going to go to is a delightful pattern called the metaphor or analogy pattern. Now, if you're familiar with Ericksonian hypnosis or you're familiar with the teachings of Jesus Christ, you'll recognize that both Erickson and Jesus both used stories, teaching tales. For Erickson, they were therapeutic metaphors. For Jesus, they were parables. But there's power in stories. So what we're going to be using metaphors or analogies to illustrate our argument, our side of the argument, or to illustrate the belief that we want to lead our client to. So, let's take a look at saying mean things means you're a bad person. A metaphor analogy might be, would a dentist be bad or mean if they told someone that they had a cavity? Next page, cancer causes death. You know, cancer is like a grassy field, and your white cells are like sheep. If stress or excessive chemotherapy, bad diet, etc. reduce the amount of sheep in the field, then the grass gets overgrown and turns to weeds. But if you concentrate on growing and adding more healthy sheep back into the field, it would reach ecological harmony again. Now, by the way, this mind map, I don't know if the entire mind map was used, but I'm told that this particular metaphor was used directly by Robert Dilts working with his mother who had cancer a number of years ago. She was not given a particularly good prognosis, but through the changing of her beliefs and, of course, other things as well, probably by changing her diet, she lived a good, long life after this. So this is an actual metaphor that was used to help someone overcome this belief that cancer causes death and move on to some healthy choices. Next page. Your being late means you don't care about me. Well, if a surgeon is late for dinner because he's saving someone's life, does that mean he doesn't care about eating? Again, a kind of joke quality there. And the last page, nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. Nuclear weapons are like cancer. The immune system might not realize the danger before it's too late. So again, you're using a metaphor or analogy to illustrate your rebuttal point. Okay? Good. Okay, so let's turn back to the first argument. Saying mean things means you're a bad person. I'm going to take a look at the two squares that fall underneath the main belief in bold that are both defined as redefine. Okay, so you redefine in both those boxes. So we're going to redefine the meaning of the words themselves that are used in each side of the syllogism, or that A equals B, A causes B thing. You'll see what I mean in a minute if you don't already. So look at the first example. Saying mean things means you're a bad person. Redefine. I'm not saying mean things. I'm telling the truth. I'm expressing my point of view. I'm stating the facts. So you're redefining mean things into telling the truth, okay? So let's look at the other side. Saying mean things means you're a bad person. I'm not a bad person. I'm just flexible. I'm honest. I'm genuine. Or you could play the sympathy card. I'm unhappy. I'm not as sensitive as you. So, maybe there's a little humor there. I don't know if it would work in a real life situation, but hey, what do you got to lose? Next page. Cancer causes death. So it's not that cancer causes death, it's the breakdown of the immune system. So let's explore ways to bolster that. Second side, cancer causes death. So redefine death. Cancer doesn't cause death, it causes loss of hope or fear. Beliefs like this that bring depression are what's dangerous. Next page. Your being late means you don't care about me. I'm not late, I was delayed. So again, you're redefining the word late and saying, I'm not late, I was delayed. You being late means you don't care about me. On the other side, it's not that I don't care, it's that I show my caring differently. Now, let's stop here for a second. I want to point something out that I mentioned before. In the you're being late means you don't care about me example, in the redefine that says, I'm not late, I was delayed, that's a logical level shift. When I say, I'm not late, that's an identity level shift. I'm not late, I was delayed by outside forces like traffic, etc. It's not necessarily a unique argument. People probably use that all the time. But I just want to point out how it is a logical level shift, and that's one of the strategies for using sleight of mouth, as you recall. So it's a logical level shift from the identity down all the way to the environment. Now, let's turn the page. Nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. Redefining the first side, it's not that nuclear weapons protect people, it's the fact that they deter people from taking aggressive action. What other things could stop people from wanting to take aggressive action? Redefining the second side, nuclear weapons don't cause safety, they cause death, which creates fear in the people who don't have them, so they have to sneak around. So in this case, we are redefining the words or the arguments within the words that the words represent in order to find some different ways of expressing. So one way you could represent this to yourself, mathematically in a syllogism, would be to say, A doesn't equal B, A equals C, and that's D. So cancer doesn't cause death, cancer causes loss of hope. And that brings depression, and that's what's dangerous. It suppresses the immune system. So it's not that the cancer causes death, not A equals B, but cancer causes loss of hope. A equals C. And that's D, right? That's the dangerous depression thing. It's a great little mathematical thing if your brain works that way to have that in mind for yourself. And the next two are a lot of fun. Chunking up and chunking down. Chunking down, by the way, is incredibly simple. Remember those two hands back a few pages, the precision model? Whenever you're asking for more specific information, that's chunking down. So let's forget about sleight of mouth for a minute. Just think about this idea of chunking down. If we take a category of something like cars, okay, so the category of automobiles, cars, let's just say cars, and we chunk down from that, we're getting more specific information like steering wheels or tires, or I might go to a type of car, like Maserati or Lincoln Continental or whatever. If I was to chunk up from cars, I might go into something like modes of transportation. I'm chunking up, I'm getting more general. So cars are just one example of many modes of transportation. Okay? So chunking up from there, you might even say just movement. If transportation is to get even more general, it'd be to movement. Okay, so chunking up, you get more general. Chunking down, you get more specific. So when I chunk down, it's very simple. When we come back to sleight of mouth now, when you look at this chunking up pattern, I actually think this is one of the few areas where it's misnamed. It's not really chunking up. We're not getting more general. You'll see in a minute it should be called the exaggerate pattern or something like that. It could probably have had a better name. So it's not chunking up in the classical sense, but it is definitely chunking down. So let's just start with that because it is so simple. Okay? So chunking down. If we say saying mean things means you're a bad person, all you have to do with sleight of mouth is go, how specifically? So in all these examples, you're going to be seeing the same thing. Bad or mean, how specifically? Which things specifically? When you say mean things, well, how am I saying them specifically that sounds so bad, or to whom? So getting more and more specific information, this might be one of the easiest of all these patterns to understand. Notice, however, you can chunk down on either the A or the B or the meaning, the bit in between. How do you know it means that? How specifically does it mean that or make that happen? So you can chunk down on the relationship aspect as well. Turn the page. Cancer causes death. Which cancers specifically? How specifically does it cause death? Dying? How specifically? So I hope you haven't gotten sick of the word specifically too much yet, because there are lots of other words that you could use instead of specifically, like how particularly or how exactly do you mean that, So turn the page. You're being late means you don't care about me. Late, define that, please. Don't care? Well, how specifically? The examples are here. How specifically does lateness mean not caring? So how do you draw that correlation to them? Okay, so we're looking at a part in the middle between the A and the B. Now, how does that mean not caring? Okay? And the last one, nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. Well, how do they make us safe? How do they specifically protect us? Which nuclear arms are we talking about? The bombs or the missiles, etc. Now, when we chunk up, it's a little bit different. Chunking up takes us to another realm. This, for me, is one of the most fun examples of all. Go back to the first of these arguments. Saying mean things means you're a bad person. So you mean if somebody slips up and happens to be irritable in their communication, then they're doomed to be evil for the rest of their life? So we're exaggerating massively, aren't we? But there's another thing we're doing beforehand. Again, that transformational vocabulary thing that I mentioned, like in the hierarchy of criteria that I mentioned before. So we're shrinking it down verbally. So instead of saying mean things, they're saying if someone slips up and happens to be irritable in their communication, that's diminishing it, I wasn't saying mean things, I just slipped up and was irritable in my communication. So we're making that smaller, and then we exaggerate the other side massively. So if anyone ever does that, they're doomed to be evil for the rest of their life. It's a massive exaggeration. So it starts with the diminishing and then exaggerating. Turn the page. Cancer causes death. Are you saying that a change or mutation in some small part of the system is going to automatically cause the destruction of the entire system? Cool, isn't it? See how that works? Now, next page. You're being late means that you don't care about me. Are you saying that the most fundamental aspect of our relationship is simply a matter of time? Again, not necessarily recommended for an actual real-life relationship, but it's kind of fun to think about. And nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. Well, since nukes and weapons cause safety, then let's give them to all the peoples of the world so that we can all be safe. Okay, so that's chunking up, and you can see how it's not just getting more general. It really is, in a sense, taking the first part of the A equals B and diminishing the A part verbally, and then just totally exaggerating the second side. It's a lot of fun. So now continuing to progress around the circle, around the mind map, we come to the left-hand corner, the counterexample. This, by the way, was one of the patterns that I discovered I did very naturally myself. Maybe you will too, or maybe you found other ones that you're good at just naturally. Just to remind you, it's having all of them that gives you the real power. So let's take a look at counterexample for saying mean things means you're a bad person. Well, isn't it possible to say mean things and not be a bad person? Or isn't it possible to be a bad person and not say mean things? Turning the page, cancer causes death. There are more and more documented cases of people who have had cancer and are surviving just fine. People die of many other things other than cancer. In fact, most medically treated cancer patients die from the severity of their treatment rather than the cancer itself. Or you could ask, have you ever heard of anyone who has had cancer and lived? Now, you can do both, by the way. Offer counterexamples that forms a statement, or you can ask questions and help the person draw it from their own references and resources. If you can do that, sometimes it's even more powerful because they're bringing up their own arguments for themselves. So if you ask them the question and they come up with an answer, that can be even better. Next, you're being late means you don't care about me on the next page. Isn't it possible to be late and still care? Or conversely, isn't it possible to be uncaring and punctual? I think so. Next, nuclear weapons, nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. Is it possible to have nuclear weapons and not be safe? Or is it possible to create safety without nukes? Or you could give counterexamples, give examples of how people have had nuclear weapons and weren't safe at all. So either ask or offer examples of counterexamples. Another very effective way of doing counterexamples is to sort of exaggerate it and ask it as a question. Let me give you an example. If someone says nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety, you might say, so are nuclear weapons the only way you can be safe? And just exaggerate it. Is that the only cause that can have that effect? Is that the only way that could ever happen? And just ask that as a question and let them answer it. Because of course it's not the only way to be safe. And they'll come up with their own counterexamples. And you know what? Sometimes that's even more powerful. One of the reasons that sleight of mouth is so powerful is that there are so many different patterns to choose from. I sometimes use the analogy of James Bond being a powerful guy, not because he's the biggest and strongest or fastest or quickest or whatever, but because he has the most toys. He's got all those neat things, and he's got the fountain pen that is actually a breathing apparatus for swimming underwater. He's got the wristwatch that does any number of things from satellite positioning to, all sorts of stuff. He's got that car that does any number of things. It can be a spaceship or a underwater vehicle. So many different possibilities are available to him. Of course he's going to win. If you're always doing the same thing over and over again, you're going to get the same results. And they become predictable, like a major league pitcher who always throws the same spot. People will hit him every time, no matter how fast he throws it. It's the same pitch. You're going to get hits, So you got to have change-ups. You got to have sliders. You got to have different approaches to take. As you start learning the sleight of mouth patterns, you're going to notice that some of these patterns are familiar to you. Some of the patterns are ones you've already been doing. Sleight of mouth gives you strength in having more than one choice. Early on, when I first started learning sleight of mouth, I got myself into a situation where I was in an argument, a passionate and heated argument about something that I believed in very strongly. And as I argued more and more with this person, I kept losing. I didn't want to lose. I wanted to win more than anything. I always felt very passionate about this particular thing, and I was still losing anyway. And so I stopped and I said, now wait a minute. I just came from a Robert Dilts Master Practitioner certification course where I learned how to do sleight of mouth. Maybe I can use some of those tools here and now. So I sort of stepped back in my mind and I looked at the whole pattern that I was talking to the person. I was sort of looked at it as it was like all these patterns are laid out in front of me on a wall chart. And I said, okay, well, there's that pattern. I'm just doing these two patterns. I'm doing counterexample and consequence, counterexample, consequence, counterexample, consequence. It's not working. What would happen if I tried something else? There's actually a basic tenet of NLP that says if what you're doing isn't working, do something different. So I applied that. What a concept. So I started saying, okay, well, listen, I know that your intent is blah, 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 and started using that pattern. And before he even had a chance to respond, I went from there to another pattern. I went, because it's really like blah, 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 and started using a metaphor pattern. And before he even responded to that one, I said, because, we're not even talking about whether A equals B or not. What we're talking about is C equaling D, which, of course, doesn't mean anything logically, but that was what I was saying to him in effect, that his belief system A equals B wasn't even the question. We were talking about something else entirely. I was using the another outcome pattern. And pretty soon, the tide had turned. I was starting to win this argument and ultimately did win the argument. Now, I'm not going to tell you details about what it was. The names have been changed to protect the innocent. In fact, they haven't even been mentioned. And it was true. It's a true story. That I just noticed that I'd been using the same patterns over and over and over again, and I wasn't winning. In order to do this, you need to be able to use all the patterns that are available to you. Have them available to you and use them. You'll be much better off. And be able to sort of step back like that and look at the patterns as if they're on a wall chart or on a clear piece of plexiglass that's in front of you and just laid out in your spatial arrangement in front of you so you can grab hold of these suckers and utilize them. It's going to make it much, much more powerful. And notice that I also didn't stop when I gave a particular argument. A lot of times you think, oh, I'm just going to say the right thing. I'm going to use one, counter example. I'm going to use one redefine. Or I'm going to use one of these patterns, and boom, it's just all going to change. It's not necessarily. It might. You might hit that one thing. It works even better when you can hit them with several things in a row. It's like, left, right, jab, jab, punch, hook. You're going to give them a bunch of things all at once. So it's this, it's counterexample, it's the hierarchy of beliefs, it's the consequence, it's redefine, it's changing frame size, followed by a reality strategy. Boom, you're done. Now looking at the pattern that has the arrow going to the left, it's still kind of indicating time in a way, because in a sense we're stepping back and looking at the intention behind the person saying that particular argument. So if you take a step back, there must be a reason they said that. Must be a reason they believe that. They must have an intention behind that. So that's why it's called the intent pattern, or the intention pattern. So let's look at saying mean things means you're a bad person. Once again, defending yourself. My intention is not to be mean, but to teach you something, to make you better, to be realistic. My intention is to protect myself. Next page, cancer causes death. You might say to the person, I know your intention is to prevent false hope, but you are preventing any hope at all. Let's find some good alternative choices. For the belief example that your being late means you don't care about me, you could say that my intention wasn't to be late or uncaring, but rather to finish my work so I could spend the highest quality time with you. And it's always good to bat your eyelashes at that point, or maybe if you have an orchestra nearby, have the music swell up. That'd be a nice thing. And the last example here, nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. Since your intention is to create safety and protection, I'm sure you'll join me in finding as many choices and alternatives as possible. So here, of course, you're going to have to do some mind reading and say, I know your intention is this or that or the other thing. You might not really know. You might be hoping. You might be fishing. If you can hit it, that's great. If you know what their intention really is, you might just wonder to yourself, what would cause them to believe this? What would cause them to think this way? And, okay, I know your intention is such and such. But if you can just do that, you can create a nice intention sleight of mouth example. Okay, so let's continue around the circle. The next one up is model of the world. Model of the world for saying mean things means you're a bad person. Well, it might be mean or bad in your model of the world, but in my family, that's how we showed that we cared. Now, I had a friend once who married this woman, and they came from very different families, very different models of the world. This was very true for him, this argument that we just heard. In his model of the world, when they argued in his family, they got intense. They were Mediterranean or something. They got intense. They raised their voices. They emoted. They told what their true feelings were loudly. And it was expected to do that. That's what you did in an argument. And the worst thing you could do would be to walk away. You handled it. You got intense until it was handled, until it was done. Now, his new bride came from a family where they never did that. They were a very proper family. And if anyone ever raised their voice, that was the worst thing that could happen. So, of course, if you raise your voice, it means you're getting out of control. So you must leave the situation and come back later and talk about it rationally when you have your emotions under control. So these two people got married. And then they had their first argument. And guess what happened? He starts getting intense. He starts raising his voice. That's the worst thing that could happen in her model of the world. So, of course, she leaves to make it so that everyone can have an even temper when they come back. Leaving, that's the worst thing you could do in his model of the world, so he chases her. It makes it even more intense. And this escalates like this. It's very interesting, very comical, really, from the outside, but probably didn't feel that way from the inside. But until they realize that they just have different models of the world, they have the same intention. They want what's best, to do what's right. They love each other, but they have different models of the world. So until they figure that out, they're going to have a little bit of a situation, aren't they? So let's go to the next example. Cancer causes death. Let me just find my paper here. In the model of the world, you could say not all medical people hold that belief. Many people believe that all of us have some mutant cells all the time, and it's only when the immune system is weakened that it becomes a problem. Next page. Your being late means you don't care about me. Well, many people I know judge caring on the basis of sensitivity to another's feelings, not their awareness of time. And the next example, nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. Well, you might call it safety and protection. I call it paranoia and fear. So again, model of the world. It's the reality that the person lives in. What might be true for you might not be true for them. Let's go on to a related one, the reality strategy. And now in NLP, a strategy is thought of as a pattern of perception that a person goes through. As an example, if the eye patterns go up and then over to the ears and then down to the right, you might say that there's strategies that they're picturing things, because when the eyes go up, they're picturing things visually in their mind. When they're talking to themselves, because when their eyes go over to the ears, they're accessing their internal dialogue. And then they're feeling things. So you're getting an internal feeling. That's their map. That's their internal strategy. That's the way they've represented or represented this experience to themselves. So in NLP, that's called a strategy. So that's their strategy for this experience. So a reality strategy is how would a person create a sense of reality in their mind so that they say, oh, yeah, that's real, that's true. How do they know it's real or not? So saying mean things means you're a bad person offers the following reality strategy rebuttal. You could say, how specifically do you know that it's bad or mean that I said them? In other words, how do you represent that in your mind? How do you understand this to be real, that it's bad or mean? And the next example, cancer causes death. How do you represent that belief to yourself? Now, if this person doesn't know anything about NLP, that's going to be the kind of example that puts them into a deep trance. How do you represent that belief to yourself? Interesting question. Now, one of my favorite questions follows right on the heels here. How would you know if it wasn't true? That's such a great question, because then, of course, they have to start searching their mind's files to find out how would they know if it wasn't true. Your being late means that you don't care about me. On the next page. So how do you know that lateness and caring are equivalents? And the reality strategy on the last page, for nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. Well, how specifically do you know that in your mind? Or how would you know if that wasn't true? You can always come back to that one, by the way. How would you know if that wasn't true? Okay, so that's the reality strategy. So the apply to self pattern, like the redefine pattern that came before it, can be applied to either side, either the A side or the B side. So you see two examples of the same pattern, one being applied to the A side, one being applied to the B side. So you can apply the apply to self to either side. Okay? So what it's like, you see this circle drawn with an arrow pointing back down at it. You're applying the belief to the person expressing the belief. And there's a lot of examples throughout history, by the way. Jesus Christ liked to do this. He said, physician, heal thyself. Or, take the log from your eye before you talk about the mote in somebody else's. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. So it's applying it right to itself. Now, this is really, really fun because it can also sometimes become non-linear, which is to say it can be a pun. You can just use the words and go off in a very non-linear way. It can be really ridiculous sometimes. Therefore, you might find this right up your alley if you're a punster or if you're a person who loves to do plays on words and find different meanings in that way. This might be right up your alley for those non-linear approaches. Some of them will, like he who's without sin cast the first stone, will be able to immediately be obvious as to how you can apply it to the same person. Saying mean things means you're a bad person. First example on the left side. Saying mean things. Well, that's a pretty mean thing to say, right? So you're applying it right back to them. Other ones might not be so obvious, and if you're not naturally a punster, it might take a little stretch to start getting into these and understanding these. Just go with it. It's fun. You'll get it as you go along. The more that you do it, as I said, the easier it's going to be. So let's take saying mean things means you're a bad person. If you apply to self on the first side, that's a pretty mean thing to say. If you say saying mean things means you're a bad person, applying itself to the second side, bad people always tend to find only the bad in others. So you can see how we're applying each side to the criteria that's there. Okay, that's a really good example to start with. Let's go on to the next page. Cancer causes death. On the A side, that belief has spread like cancer over the past few years. It would be interesting to see what would happen if it died out. On the second side, the B side, that's a pretty deadly belief to hold on to. It can only lead to a dead-end street. Now, what's a deadly belief, And what's a dead-end street? What's that have to do with cancer? But it can be applied, and the words are very similar. Dead end and death, deadly belief. So it's a little non-linear, but it's also pretty obvious. Pretty content-oriented as well. Some of these other ones might not be so much. Let's take a look at you're being late means you don't care about me. I love this one on the first side. Well, now you tell me. I wish you'd cared enough about me to tell me earlier. So applying the criteria to the self. And you're being late means that you don't care about me. A really caring person would be able to overlook a little tardiness now and then. Again, there's that transformation of vocabulary, right? A little tardiness. You might have been half hour late. Hey, it's just a little tardy. Okay, so it means you don't care about me. A really caring person could overlook that. And the last page, nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. The fallout that this belief might have as a byproduct could be as devastating as an atomic blast if it bombs. So there are some really punny things in there. The fallout, the bombing, etc. And nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. Are you sure that's a safe belief to hold on to so strongly? So in all these examples, you can see how they can be applied to the criteria, but some of them perhaps a little bit more directly than others, a little bit less directly in some cases. There are some other examples that could be very nonlinear, very punny, and that's okay. When that happens, it's just like, just go with it. Sometimes it's when you're doing sleight of mouth, it's clear a single rebuttal won't be enough. And these, the apply to selves, can either be just perfect or they can be kind of, make the person think, what's that going on? Sort of knock them off balance a little bit. Open the door, stick your foot in the door to change a belief. It can be very subtle, but useful. Apply to self. Moving on to changing frame size now. The one right in the middle of the page, middle top middle. You've got different sized frames there, growing bigger. It can be the same thing over time, a little bit like the consequence pattern in a way. And it's even more like just taking a larger viewpoint. Great example in movies once. I don't know if you ever saw the movie Cabaret, but there's one scene that's so perfect for changing frame size. It starts with a tight shot, a close-up of this young, beautiful-looking boy, probably, 16, 17 years old. Blonde hair, blue eyes, very forthright-looking, very almost innocent and inspired-looking. He's looking up in the sky and singing this song. And the camera angles from the bottom up, so it's like the sky behind him, very blue, beautiful sky. And he starts singing with his lovely voice, something about, the sun in the valley is summery warm. The stag in the forest runs free. Right? And it's beautiful. And then the camera starts panning back. And you see that he's dressed in some sort of brown uniform. And it keeps panning back. And as it gets lower and lower down, more and more of a picture is being shown. You see that he's got a armband along his arm that's red. And it's got the black Nazi symbol on it. And as it pans back even further, you see that he's, a young Nazi guy, the young Nazis organization. And the people in this cabaret, this outdoor cafe in Austria in the mountains in the Alps, are all sitting in terror, trying not to show that, trying to look like, oh, yes, isn't this nice that this young Nazi guy is singing like this. He's standing on a chair at this outdoor cafe. It's just chilling as you pull out like that. So that's the changing frame size. In the first frame, it's one way, but as you look at it in a bigger picture, it's very different. Okay, so let's look at our examples. Saying mean things means you're a bad person. Changing frame size. Well, it may seem mean now, but if you look at the bigger picture, you'll see it was necessary. So think about changing frame size sometimes as a context. It might be true in this context, but in a different context, it might well be different. Or it could be the same action over time. Changing frame size is looking at things in a bigger picture. It may seem mean now, but if you look at the bigger picture, it was necessary to say those mean things in order to help make things better. Next page. Cancer causes death. Is that a belief you'd like your child to have? If everyone had that belief, we'd never have any hope of finding a cure. Next page. Your being late means you don't care about me. Better late than never. With the warm, caring reception I get when I do get here, I ought to be risking my life to get here every spare minute. Again, not necessarily recommended for real life. And lastly, nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. Changing frame size. Well, for how long, or how many nukes, or for whom, or from what? So you can see that with those questions, you're really asking for a examination of the different contexts in which that might be true or not true. But overall, changing frame size is looking at things in a bigger picture. So let's go on to the meta frame. Up at the top of the page, you'll see the meta frame. It's drawn over all of them. Now, to me, the way I think this is represented is kind of like a God's eye view, like you're up above it all looking down, like from the heavens. Another way of thinking about it could be that you're like a great psychiatrist, like Sigmund Freud, and you can just know what a person's really thinking. You can just get inside. So it's either God or he's omniscient and can really just know what the person's thinking, what their motivations are behind it, just really see it clearly right down to their soul, or a great psychotherapist type of thing. So the meta frame. So let's start with saying mean things means you're a bad person. Well, you're just saying that because you're oversensitive or you don't understand. You're imperceptive. You're stuck in your own way. Or I'm the only one that cares enough about them to say these things. Now look at cancer causes death. You have that simplistic belief because you don't have a model that allows you to explore and track and test all of the complex variables that contribute to the life and death process. Again, tonality could make that into an okay statement. It could also make it into a nasty kind of statement, depending on how you say these things. Case in point, your being late means you don't care about me. Well, you're just feeling that way because you build unrealistic expectations about other people and then blame it on them when you get disappointed. Again, don't try this at home. These are professionals here. This could be dangerous. And lastly, nuclear arms cause strength, protection, and safety. You're only saying that to cover the fact that you don't have the understanding or technology or debate skills or personal power to change people and protect yourself without intimidating or coercing others. Remember Timothy Leary and G. Gordon Liddy. So this metaframe, this is a place where you're acting like God. And how it is possible that they could believe this, that you're getting into their head and you're saying, oh, I understand how it's possible that they believe this, and give it right into their face. It's not necessarily a pleasant choice all the time. You saw some examples where that was pretty much really in your face kind of examples. The thing about it is that sometimes so powerful that is, if you're right, they might not respond immediately receptively, but they might come back, after they've cooled off a bit and say, you know what? You're right. I do create those unrealistic expectations and then blame other people, and I'm sorry. Yeah, not likely, but it could happen. It could happen. That's the metaframe. Okay, so that's it. That's the presentation of Sleight of Mouth. Now it's up to you. You've got the complete deluxe toolkit. Now it's up to you to use it and to master it. In your book, there are additional patterns that I wrote out based on the belief because change with NLP is so fast, it won't last, which means it's not worth doing. It's a belief that most NLP practitioners have heard at one time or another coming from skeptical clients or potential clients or other people. So it's written out in the complete triangle, square, circle, cause, effect, meaning, structure. And then it's divided up into two component relationships, the cause and the effect and the criteria meaning. A causes B, B equals C relationships. And then two complete different mind maps, Sleight of Mouth mind maps, are written out based on each of those two individual things. So because it's too fast, then it won't last. And also because it won't last, that means it's not worth doing. Those are all written out in your books. I'm not going to take the time here to go over them on this CD set, but you can look at them and examine them and use some of those for yourself. So that's the kind of thing I want you to do. I want you to find a belief that's something that comes up in your world. Maybe you're an NLP practitioner and you can just use that one, that's fine. But come up with other ones that come up in your world so that you'll be armed, you'll be ready to use the Sleight of Mouth pattern. So you write out an example of a belief, then write out all the different patterns. Write out the hierarchy of criteria, followed by the consequence, followed by another outcome, et cetera, et cetera. Just go through the whole set. Have them there. But then notice on the pages that say, it doesn't have to be in that order, that you present them to the person. They'll come out fluidly in a variety of different ways, and you can see how they can go from, one pattern to another pattern to another pattern to another pattern to another pattern, asking questions, giving statements, a variety of different things that happen all at once. The tools are yours if you want them. They're right there. Sleight of Mouth gives us the ability to be flexible with belief systems, and it gives us the ability to influence other people in their belief systems. And when we get down to it, it really begins to show us that belief systems are flexible. And then we have to start asking ourselves questions like, well, what do we believe and why? And what is a useful belief as opposed to a non-useful belief? And how do I go ahead and change my own? And then when you start getting into things like that, it can get pretty, scary for some people, unsettling. They're looking for more of a solid grounding, that I feel good when I know what I know. I'm reminded of the story of The Magus by James Fowler, I believe. It's a story of a prince who grows up in a kingdom, and his father, the king, has told him of 3 truths. He said, "As you grow up, son, 3 things you must remember. There are no princesses, there's no such thing as islands, and there's no such thing as God." He grew up believing these things. It had always been true. It was just like basic presuppositions, just knowing that this is true. Didn't ever question it. One day, as he got older, he was about 17, 18, 19, old enough to strike out and have some adventures of his own, he left the kingdom. He went wandering. He was riding through the forest and got through the forest and came out the other side and went through the hillsides and stuff on his horse. One day he came to the end of land. He came to the ocean. Standing on these cliffs overlooking the ocean, this incredible broad expanse of water he'd never seen before. And there, out on the ocean, were some land masses. These little bodies of land out there. He didn't really understand what those things were. They looked kind of like those mythical islands that he'd heard about, but he knew they didn't exist because his father had always told him so. So what were they? He was confused. He was puzzled. Even more puzzling were these creatures that inhabited those islands. They were close enough that he could see that they were pretty interesting. They looked an awful lot like princesses, but he knew that they couldn't be any princesses because his father had always told him so. So he didn't know what they were. And then along came this man walking along the shoreline, a very tall, dramatic-looking man wearing a long black robe, and his sleeves were rolled up. And he said, "Excuse me, sir, can you tell me what those things are out there, those land masses?" And the guy said, "Certainly, those are islands." He said, "Islands? I didn't think they existed. Well, what are those strange and beguiling creatures on those islands?" He said, My boy, those are princesses. He said, my goodness. Oh, if there are islands and there are princesses, then there must also be a god. And the man bowed and he said, yes, I am God. And the boy was quite impressed with this, and he went running back to his kingdom. He said, Father, Father, you'll never guess. I saw real islands and real princesses, and I met and spoke to God. His father laughed a little bit, and then he said, I'm afraid, son, you have been deceived. This God person, was he by any chance wearing a long black robe? And the son remembered back and said, well, yes, as a matter of fact, he was. He said, by any chance were his sleeves rolled up? The son said, yes, they were. And the king said, well, that was not God, my boy. That was a wizard. And you have been deceived. That was just an illusion. There are not real islands, there are not real princesses, but an illusion created by that magician. So the son went back, left the kingdom again, went back out through the forest, through over the mountains and back to the cliffs. He still saw those islands. There were still beautiful princesses on them. It's pretty interesting that this illusion would still be there, but eventually the man came walking along the shoreline again. And he accosted him and said, I know who you are. You're a magician. Those aren't real islands. Those aren't real princesses. You fooled me. Those are illusions. He said, actually, no, those are real. And I am God, but you, good lad, have been deceived. Your father all these years has told you he's a king. He's no king. You don't live in a kingdom. He's a magician. Ask him. So he goes back home, and he's very troubled and very confused, and he says, Father, is this true? Could this possibly be true? His father stood up from the throne, smiled a strange kind of smile, rolled up the sleeves of his robe, and suddenly the walls of the kingdom melted, vanished. And they were standing not in a courtroom, but by the shores of the sea. And out there were islands and princesses. And he said, oh my goodness, there are islands, there are princesses, and there is a God. That man is a god, and you're just a wizard. And he said, well, no, not exactly. And then the other man walked up, and his sleeves were rolled up as well. And he said, actually, I'm a magician also. Oh, and by the way, those aren't real islands. Those are illusions. And they melted away, just like the walls of the kingdom had. And the son said, well, if there are no real islands, and there are no real princesses, and there's no kingdom, and there's nothing worth living for, I'd rather just die. And so, by magic, the king and his crony, the other magician, had Death appear. And Death reached out his bony hand towards the boy, and he shook with fear and finally said, wait, well, hold on, time out. Wait a minute. You know what? If I have to make do with illusory islands and illusory princesses, I think that'd be okay. I could learn to live with that. And they handed him a robe, and they said, congratulations. You've just taken your first step in becoming a wizard.